Thank you for everyone for joining us. We will be recording this session. We do have a packed agenda, so we are going to go ahead and just get started. Welcome to part one of the Perfect Storm of Extraction, Poverty and Climate Change webinar series, Economic Drivers and of Climate Vulnerability and Resilience webinar. My name is Zully Juarez, she, her, and I am the Senior Research and Policy Analyst with Just Solutions, and I'm calling in from Tongvaland, also known as Los Angeles, California. I'll get us started to talk a little bit about Just Solutions. And at any point, feel free to add your name as well as the organization and where you're calling from in the chat. So Just Solutions is a BIPOC-led national climate organization that partners with communities disproportionately impacted by climate change to turn their priorities and ideas into policies and laws. So we are broadening and deepening the understanding of equitable and effective policies and projects, and are fostering a national community of peer learning for Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous, and frontline community-based organizations to then elevate their solutions and replicate them across the country. And once again, feel free to add your name, organization, and location in the chat so everyone can know who else is on the call. Next slide. Today's webinar will improve our understanding of the real-world economic conditions that constrain the capacity of frontline communities to cope with, prepare for, and respond to climate change, as well as introduce a framework grounded in key indicators to help us measure the adaptive capacity and resilience of frontline communities and the positive or negative effects of those public policies. Next slide. So briefly, the agenda for today's event includes introduction of today's speakers, a presentation of our findings of our recently published Perfect Storm report, and we'll add that link into the chat, and presentations from our guest panelists. So we will end with a Q&A discussion. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A box so that we can answer your questions during the time. Next slide. So the authors of the Perfect Storm report include myself, Zully Juarez, Senior Research and Policy Analyst with Just Solutions, and my colleague, Jennifer Moon, a research consultant with Moonlight Solutions. So Jennifer has over 20 years of experience in social services and public health, serving as a researcher, analyst, program manager, and communicator, and will be presenting today's research findings. Next slide. Thank you. Our featured partner organizations include the Economic Analysis and Research Network at the Economic Policy Institute, which is a network of research policy and advocacy organizations across the country. EARN prioritizes racial and gender equity and advances an inclusive work-centered economy through state and local policy change, rigorous research and collaboration between researchers, advocates, and community groups in state and local communities across the country in pursuit of a just economy. Next slide. Our guest panelist is Chandra Childers, Senior Policy and Economic Analyst with EARN at the Economic Policy Institute. Chandra's work is primarily focused on supporting EARN's state and local policy research and advocacy network in the Southern United States. Using an intersectional lens, her research focuses on employment earnings, job quality, and worker power. We're super excited to have her. Next slide. Our second featured partner organization is cdcb, Come Dream, Come Build. They are a nonprofit community housing development organization serving the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. Founded in 1974, cdcb provides safe, sanitary, affordable housing and is now one of the largest nonprofit producers of single-family housing for home ownership in the state. cdcb works to create sustainable communities through quality education, model financing, efficient home design, and superior construction. Next slide. Our guest panelist is Daniel Elkin, is the Director of Policy, Impact, and Innovation at Come Dream, Come Build. He is responsible for initiating research initiatives and advocates on behalf of policies that expand home ownership at the local, state, and federal levels. In addition, he coordinates cdcb's resource development and data collection efforts. We're super happy to have Daniel as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer, the co-author of the Perfect Storm, to share with us findings of the report.
Thanks, Zully. We're excited to share the findings of our report today. And also we're looking forward to future discussions, including a webinar that we're going to be holding later this year, featuring speakers from some of the communities that we profiled in the report. And you can find the full report through the chat link that is the link that's in the chat, or the bit.ly link that's here. As we know, BIPOC and frontline communities bear the disproportionate burden of environmental and climate impacts. Through a variety of studies and mapping efforts, we can identify those communities that are at greater risk, and we can identify the many factors that put them at risk, but we're less successful at communicating the causal relationships or how these conditions came to be and how they're perpetuated through policymaking. So through our report, we used a case study approach to examine what we called pre-existing conditions in 6 frontline communities. And these conditions affect the capacity of residents to cope with, prepare for, and respond to climate change. We looked at 3 domains: economic, health, and infrastructure conditions. And our goal was to communicate the real world conditions across these communities, and then, as Zully said, to develop a framework for examining adaptive capacity and resilience as these communities and others like them respond to climate change. So today we're focusing on economic conditions, and in our next webinar, we'll be talking about health and infrastructure, and then we'll also be talking about community-driven solutions in the future in the fall. Next slide, please. So first, a few definitions. We wanted to highlight not only risk factors relating to climate disasters, but also the ability to cope with current challenges associated with climate change, such as paying for the increased cost of heating and cooling, or participating in the transition to a clean energy economy. And that includes investment in greenhouse gas reduction at the household and community levels, and also positioning for green jobs and development. Next slide. So these are the communities that we profiled. They were selected for their geographic diversity. They're a mix of rural and urban areas spread out across the country, and many of them are counties, except for 2, the east end of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and East Las Vegas, Nevada, which are zip codes in urban areas. And then as a counterpoint, we also looked at Marin County, which is located just north of San Francisco and is one of the wealthiest counties in the country. So these communities that we profiled share several characteristics in common. They're all very low income with high rates of poverty. In these communities, 25% or more of their population was living in poverty in 2020, as defined by the federal poverty guidelines. So the conditions in these communities are among the most challenging in the country, and they were selected based on the premise that improved outcomes in these communities will reflect positive policy change benefiting frontline communities generally. They're also majority BIPOC, with the exception of McDowell County in West Virginia. However, McDowell is one of the most diverse counties in West Virginia, and it has one of the state's few Black majority towns. They also all have significant histories of resource extraction, labor exploitation, or financial speculation. And as described in the paper, their current conditions are the result of past policies and exploitive practices that have left them behind. Despite these histories, they all demonstrate resilience and innovation and adaptive capacity, despite continuing trends of neglect at the worst and oppression at the best. Neglect at the best and oppression at the worst. We conducted interviews with representatives of each of the communities profiled. Their voices are highlighted throughout the report, and in some cases, residents spoke about the assets, challenges, and innovative practices in their communities. And in others, those who worked closely with residents shared their understanding of local conditions. Those interviewed present compelling evidence of the real life daily conditions in these places and community strengths and resilience, and also what will be needed to improve community outcomes. So as I mentioned, They all experienced exploitation of labor or resources, followed by various forms of divestment. In several cases, investments were made in order to extract economic gain. And then when resources were expended, the communities and their residents fell into decline. In Hidalgo County, Texas, for example, industrial waste is now presenting significant health hazards to residents and jeopardizes safety if or when a climate disaster strikes. And in the Black majority community of Keystone in McDowell County, West Virginia, they were under a boil water notice for 10 years because of abandoned infrastructure left behind by mining companies. In the east end of Bridgeport, most of the housing stock consists of rentals left behind from the days when the east end was a manufacturing center with tenement housing for workers. And then the effects of redlining practices after World War II have also resulted in high rates of renters in the east end. So the combination of economic factors is limiting the ability to cope with, prepare for, and respond to climate change and to ensure a transition to a clean energy economy. Next slide. So these are the indicators that we looked at in the paper. Many of these are familiar. There included many other studies considering communities that are most vulnerable to climate change. And others here are less commonly considered, such as household debt and access to credit, insurance, and banking. So to give you some sense of the data we reported in the paper, we wanted to share two charts with you that highlight net worth and debt delinquency. So residents paradoxically have both too much debt and too little credit. Many households have zero or negative net worth, are unbanked or underbanked, or have debt delinquency issues that are posing a challenge to accessing financing and wealth building opportunities. And in most of these communities, the percentage of households with zero or negative net worth exceeds the national average. Next slide. On this slide, you can see that debt delinquency levels are quite high, especially for BIPOC residents. And in many cases, they exceed the national average. And it should be noted that falling behind on payments leads to a cycle of accumulating debt from both interest payments, which then combines with worsening credit scores to further restrict credit access. So those we interviewed validated the conditions that we saw in the data. They spoke to the consequences of limited banking and insurance access, the lack of capacity to respond to economic stressors currently, which are only going to grow worse with climate change, and the financial obstacles of participating in a just transition. So looking at all these indicators that we examined together, we can see the practical implications for climate adaptation and resilience and for a just transition. So inadequate income combined with rising costs is exposing residents to difficulty paying everyday expenses, as well as the increased burdens that come with climate change. And then language barriers can affect employment prospects or present challenges in accessing assistance. And health impacts can be significant, as we will discuss in our next webinar, for residents who are already living with high rates of chronic conditions and other health challenges. So what can we do? So these are a few of the policies that we identify in the report that could address some of the challenges that these communities face. These include ensuring that residents have adequate household incomes so that they can better adapt to climate change. And we can also make it much easier to access services by streamlining benefit application processes, as well as ensuring a continuity of services through things like moratorium policies to prevent utility shutoffs. And we can also prioritize these communities for economic development opportunities to ensure that they're able to participate equitably in the transition to a clean energy economy. So takeaways. Public policy has made these communities what they are, and future policymaking will similarly determine whether or not we achieve climate justice and a just transition or not. We would argue that measuring indicators like the ones that we presented in the report will help us to determine whether policymaking is effective or not. And with that, I'll pass it on to Chandra to share her work at Economic Policy Institute.
Thank you very much. And so I'm going to, since Zully already introduced me, if I could go ahead and get the next slide. And since she's already introduced me and introduced the EARN team, Economic Analysis and Research Network, that was just a map of where many of our EARN groups are. So you can see that we have EARN groups all across the nation. And I did want to highlight one thing. We are part of the larger Economic Policy Institute, but while they focus on the national level, we do focus on state and local policies. So that's kind of where our work is. And so what I want to do is kind of provide maybe a broader picture than we see in the perfect storm that also may help us understand those findings in that report. So if I could get the next slide, please. And so what we have here are two quotes. And what I'm wanting to do with these is really highlight this economic model that's kind of in place across many of the states in the South. Tennessee is committed to providing an attractive business climate with the focus on low debt, a pro-business regulatory environment. Tennessee is proud to be a right-wing state with no personal income tax on wages. Our state and local tax burdens are among the lowest in the country. This is from the chamber there. And then below that, we have a quote from the former governor of, I think, South Carolina. I wrote the wrong state there. We discourage any companies that have unions from wanting to come to South Carolina because we don't want to taint the water. And so what these do, along with a few of the implications of these economic development approaches, is they describe what we are calling the failed Southern economic development model. And so what this model is, it's exactly what you see here: low taxes, little regulation on businesses, whether that's environmental degradation or treatment of workers. Low taxes mean a weak safety net. It's anti-union. It's anti-anything that empowers workers. So this is the framework that we are working within when we're looking at this economic model. And I want to highlight that what this means is that politicians are looking out for themselves. They're looking out for the wealthy and powerful. So that means that workers not only don't get protection from their political leaders, they also are left unable to protect themselves. So next slide. And to provide a picture of the South, so what we see, first of all, of the 4 regions of the country, the South has the largest population of any region. And not only does it have the largest population, it is the fastest growing population. So we see the population of the South growing, but perhaps more importantly, it's becoming increasingly diverse. The mention of the BIPOC, of these BIPOC communities, well, they're becoming more and more across the South. So we are seeing a young population across the South. We are seeing an increasingly diverse and growing population across the South. And I think that's really important backdrop there. And I'm gonna say, I'm gonna go quickly through these given the limited amount of time. So if I could get the next slide. And here we can see that population growth over time. So as you're looking at this, you can see the green line is the growth in population. And we see the South gaining population fairly rapidly. And then we see job growth. And again, there is job growth, but it is lagging population growth, barely able to keep up. And then since the 2008 recession, it has fallen further behind. However, and if I could get the next slide. Where the South does shine is in being able to attract auto manufacturing jobs. So while manufacturing jobs overall have been on the decline, politicians across the South have been able to provide companies with subsidies and tax breaks and these nice little packages to relocate to the South. And we are seeing here, what you can see in this table is the growth or decline in auto manufacturing jobs over time. And we can see here that the South is the only region to have actually gained jobs. The Midwest, with the largest absolute number of auto manufacturing jobs, has also seen the largest decline in auto manufacturing jobs. But they are moving to the South as politicians are luring them in. We're seeing, Hyundai, we're seeing all of these different car companies come in. If I could get the next slide. And so seeing that change, it begs the question of, these are jobs that are generally considered good jobs. What are happening to these jobs as they're as we're seeing a shift in where these jobs are occurring? And so in this table, what you see are the 8 employers or the 8 states with the largest number of auto manufacturing jobs. And 4 of the 8 happen to be Southern states. And what we can see is Michigan, which has the largest average annual employment, and the annual wage per employee there is almost $75,000. And then when we go down to our Southern states, Tennessee is our first Southern state that we get to, and we can see that the annual wages per employee there is just almost $56,000. Kentucky, 55, Alabama, 54. In South Carolina, it gets up to 60. So again, this is not making a causal argument, but it is showing that earnings for workers in the South are lower compared to their counterparts in other regions of the country. And next slide. And here, this allows us to do a couple of things. This one, it allows us to see, again, as the South is becoming increasingly diverse, it's allowing us to see who's moving into these jobs that are being created, but it also allows us to, again, not a causal analysis, but to see if the quality of these jobs that are already in the South, if they're remaining. So it's comparing to the South to itself over time. And the first thing that stands out here, we look at the race and sex composition of workers in these jobs at 2 time periods, 2000 to 2005 and then 2015 to 2019. And we had to combine these to get large enough sample sizes. And what we see is that the first time period, white men make up the majority of workers in these jobs, followed by white women and then smaller shares of other groups. By the time we get to the 2019 time period, we've seen substantial diversification of these jobs. White men have dropped below half, and we've seen gains among other groups. But when we look at earnings, what we can see is, one, most groups make even small gains. Their earnings increase a little. White men and Black men are the groups that experience the declines. And again, those 2 groups together account for the majority of these jobs. White men see a small decline in their earnings, a 6% change, but Black men experience a 20% decline. So we are, this is kind of an indication that the quality of these jobs are declining. And there's other research that also indicates that not only are earnings declining, that pro-regulatory environment, it means that, and the lack of unionization, it means that the benefits that workers receive may be declining. I've seen some research that indicates that the injury rate, again, is increasing. So we're seeing all around that these jobs, the quality of these jobs are changing. And we've also seen reports of the use of child labor, especially in auto parts manufacturing, abuse of immigrant workers. So we're seeing this all around. And so this I wanted to highlight because this auto manufacturing, and with all the federal funds and money that's going into the states, these are likely, we're likely to see a growth in this. So that's an important thing to look at. And now I want to zoom back out a little bit. If I could get the next slide. And so what I want to do now is I want to provide an overview of the larger economic outcomes for all workers. So here we have the median wage for workers, and the yellow line is the median wage for Southern workers compared to other regions of the country. And we can see that since 1979, looking at this over time, workers in the South have had lower median wages than workers in any other region. And while I know people know this, I think people don't think about it, but median wage means that half of all workers earn even less. So not only are their wages the lowest, that it's even less for half of those workers. Next slide. And I also wanted to highlight a lot of this data. In the report, we'll break things out by states, in the reports, plural. But here I do like to highlight that there are broad differences across states, even within the region. So we are using the census definition of the South for this. And so that includes like Washington, D.C., it includes Maryland and Delaware. But where we can see policy changes, we can also see differences in outcomes. So the difference for median wage for a worker in Mississippi is dramatically different than for a worker in DC, Virginia, or Maryland. And one policy difference that stands out for me is like DC, Maryland, and Virginia all have much higher minimum wages than do say Mississippi and Oklahoma, where either there is no minimum wage as in Mississippi, or the minimum wage is just, and the federal minimum applies there, and the federal minimum applies in say Oklahoma. So that's, you see these policy differences that are important to understand. Next slide, please. And here we're looking at the share of the share of residents who fall below the poverty line. And I'd like to highlight that again, the poverty line already fails to capture the economic insecurity that families face. But again, we can see that the South has the highest poverty rate of all the regions, and that is over decades. We see that that has not changed. Next slide, please. And I did want to highlight, I'm not going to read through each of these, but two things on this that I want to highlight, that women in Kentucky, Arkansas, West Virginia, Louisiana, and Mississippi all have poverty rates above 17%. So, really high levels of poverty. And then child poverty is also rampant in many of these. Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware are the only states that have poverty rates below the national level. And when we look at that, that was even looking pre-pandemic. And that was another important point. Like, we really want to understand that this is not a result of the pandemic or the recession. Like, this is, that's another reason those trends are important. Next slide, please. And here, basically, this just highlights one of the pushback that I quite often get when talking about lower wages in the South is that the South has a lower cost of living. And that's true. The South, you're going to pay less for rent in Kentucky than in New York City. That's definitely true. But the real question is your household income enough to meet your basic needs, not higher or lower than another state? And what we can see here, while there are many communities across the South where household income does meet basic needs, there are also many others where it does not. And that's what we can see here. And this is at the metropolitan statistical area. So we're not talking about wide states with such great variation. This is at the metro level. And we can see that it's not enough necessarily for many families to meet their basic needs. Next slide, please. And it's not just high poverty, it's high levels of inequality. And I want to emphasize here that this is not unique to the South. I looked at all the states, and this levels of inequality is across the board. As you can see, DC is right there at the top. What this is the Gini coefficient, and it tells us, it runs from 0 to 1, and it tells us from perfect equality to perfect inequality. And what you can see is inequality is increasing, and we see a particularly significant increase across the 80s, but it's still going up. Next slide. And this is just a different measure of inequality. It's the share of income going to the top 5% of households and the top 20% of households. And almost a quarter in most states go to just 5%. And over half of income in most states go to the top 20%. I don't have a slide for it, but the bottom 20% gets less than 5% of household income. Next slide. How we got here. We got here because wealthy, powerful business interests like low taxes and they like cheap labor. So you have politicians that will oppose unions, use voter suppression, use preemption to stop local communities from implementing policies that would benefit workers, and lack of regulations. There's more to that, but yeah, for time's sake, I'm going to say next slide. And this is just basically to sum up what we've just discussed. What we get with this economic model is lower wages, lower economic mobility, more poverty and inequality, greater economic security, poor overall quality of life, more social divisions and extremism. And next slide. Thank you all for your time very much. And I am going to hand it over to Daniel.
Thank you, Chandra. And thank you, Jennifer. Both of you are really compelling research that I think speaks to the realities that I see in our communities here in the Rio Grande Valley. And so I wanted to start off today by really talking about the title here, Rural Resilience, Going Beyond Disaster Response. And what I want to talk about is, as I said, here in South Texas, we match a lot of the profiles of what you discussed. We are a region that faces disinvestment. We are a region that is rarely prioritized in policy. And we are one that faces generational poverty. We are a persistent poverty area. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about what that translates to on the ground when trying to kind of respond to disaster, which is an increasingly a common problem facing persistent poverty communities across the country. And the one thing I want to leave you with, I'll start with the main idea, and then we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts. But it really is that our communities are really forced to figure out how to pre-plan for disaster. And that's often the biggest challenge for us, because when the federal government or when other resources come into our community after a disaster, they often come in without all of that historical context, without that economic grounding and understanding that I think Jennifer and Chandra provided about our communities. And so that's our main idea. The takeaway is, how can we kind of take the power back and kind of start to build some of that resilience in our community? And so that is really our main focus, is how can we pre-plan? How can we come up with our own solutions? So next slide, please. The other thing I wanted to start off with too is that it's not just us here in South Texas. What we found is that when we would go to conferences across the country and we would be talking with other people from other areas, we found that there were some allies out there. We found that, yes, South Texas is disinvested in. South Texas faces this history of extraction and colonialism, really. But there are other regions that face similar historical realities, that face similar economic realities. And so we joined together with those other organizations to form the Partners for Rural Transformation. And when I'm talking about these other regions, I'm talking about Indian country, I'm talking about Appalachia, I'm talking about the Mississippi Delta and the Black Belt, the rural West. These places have different histories, but I think, as Jennifer showed in some of her research, a lot of these areas have incredible similarities in terms of what they're facing materially and economically. And so we decided, let's get together. Let's start using our voices to kind of start pushing policy change across the country in rural communities and sharing those experiences. So we formed the Partners for Rural Transformation, 6 CDFIs coming together to address these problems. And I would like to echo our belief that intentional policy choices got us here, right? Chandra just said it. I think Jennifer said it in her research. Intentional policies got our region to where it is, and only intentional policies are going to get them out. So let's go over some of what we face in our region. As we mentioned, extraction, extractive economies. What does that translate to in terms of policy? Is that often when we're dealing with policymakers at the state and federal level, they only look at our community and the value of it as far as what they can get out of it, mainly resources. right? And so right there's often a kind of language gap with policymakers that we have to face. Also, discrimination and outright racism impact how we're able to kind of respond to different economic situations within our region. To give you just one example of something that we deal with in terms of disaster response, since I'm going to be getting more into disaster response in a moment, but I want to give you just an example. After a disaster happens, FEMA's main response is to assess damages, which makes sense, right? We need to get in a sense of what damages have occurred in your community and how can we address those post-disaster. And so they send contractors and damage assessors down into our region, usually from somewhere else, to go ahead and kind of figure that out. And as one of the things that we always face is they come down and they know nothing about our community. They know nothing about the history. They know nothing about colonias, which are a unique community type in the US-Mexico border region. They don't speak Spanish. We are a majority Latino population, mostly Spanish speakers. And so this is where we're running into a lot of problems. And the answer we get from FEMA is, yeah, we'll try to address that in the future, but it's usually a shrug, right? And I think that's just an example that kind of shows that at some point that shrug off, that non-response, that's a value judgment. That's a value statement, and that's structural racism in action. And in general, many of the things we've already discussed, we have barriers of access to capital. We are a region that is high debt and low wages, just as Jennifer pointed out. And so this is a major problem. Average median income in some of our poorest communities, $15,000 a year, just to give you some idea. Household incomes, $42,000. In colonias, $35,000. So that's the entire households. We're talking some major issues here. Community vulnerability, we face major infrastructure problems. Even before a disaster, just regular rain, we have flooding throughout our communities, right? Before we can even get to, say, a hurricane or major weather event. So how do we address kind of all of these problems? There's really two ways that we try to kind of find our own solutions within our community. Next slide, please. One of those is trying to kind of improve the economic health of our community so that it's a little more resilient towards disasters. This is built into our business model here at CDCB. We do financial coaching. And so we have thousands of clients coming through our building every year. And we're able to kind of learn from them, what is hurting your finances the most? And again, the answer is always, I have a predatory loan that I have fallen into. And so what a predatory loan is we're talking a high interest loan. In Texas, that translates to about 600% in interest for a loan, right? They'll tell you it's 20 to 25, maybe 30%, but the reality is it's about 600% after you take into account for fees. And so this is another extractive industry that's taken root within our community, is really taking what little wealth people can save up and taking it away. And so we decided here at CDCB, an on-the-ground solution that we could offer is the creation of a community loan center. We're able to use subsidy and financial leveraging to create small dollar loans so that when people face a broken down car, a health issue of any kind, or just have to miss work for whatever reason, if they run into financial trouble, they need liquidity, small dollar liquidity, and they're able to get that from our community loan center. You can see here in the chart the difference in savings just in fees alone. Before we even get into interest rates, we are able to provide meaningful savings and really kind of try and improve people's financial situations. So that way we can improve community resiliency. Building wealth is our goal. Yes, we want to make people homeowners, but we want to make people homeowners for a reason, which is that improves their resiliency and improves their ability to weather the storm, so to speak. And so that's one of the ways that we are trying to kind of combat poverty in our area and put these people on more solid financial footing. Next slide, please. Another program that we have implemented to try to improve disaster resiliency and address many of these kind of inequalities that our communities face is Rapido, which is the Rapid Housing Recovery Pilot Program. And its design purpose is to bring permanent housing to a community after a disaster. But again, this is where I get into the importance of pre-planning, because to us, it is our belief that 90% of the work needs to be done before a disaster ever strikes. So if you're trying to create permanent housing for your communities, most of that work needs to be done well before the disaster strikes. We call this pre-covering. And this is often the step that is missed. This is often the step that is skipped. When a disaster strikes, the federal government comes in. Communities are often not ready to kind of figure out how to leverage those federal dollars towards solutions. And so we believe it's important for rural communities and persistent poverty communities to try and do as much of this organizing beforehand as possible. The reason being is that building a home, even in a normal circumstances, like non-disaster circumstances, requires navigating a complex patchwork of financing, regulatory structures, and on-the-ground logistics. This is what we do. We're an affordable housing organization. I can tell you, it's really hard to do. And that's in normal circumstances. Post-disaster, you're trying to build permanent housing that replaces the housing stock that was destroyed or damaged. You've got to be able to do that on an accelerated timeline with more federal agencies involved. It can be a real hassle. So next slide, please. The dead end that you often run into in a housing plan is the transition from temporary housing to a permanent home. So let me just give you a quick rundown of some of the logistics that we have found is a problem. After a disaster, FEMA pays for temporary housing, and they can pay up to $100,000 for a temporary unit, but none of their money can be used for a permanent unit, an additional permanent unit. So what we've done is we have kind of condensed all of this into one step. So that way we can actually build both the temporary unit and the permanent home all in one step. So we start by getting the temporary unit, on the ground. We're getting people housed and we're getting them in there. And then we're using those same dollars to then expand the home into a permanent home. This is extremely important for rural and persistent poverty areas because a lot of this capacity can be built beforehand with federal dollars as long as you do the pre-planning that's required. So next slide, please. How it works is the construction of these core temporary units before disaster even happens. So you're building capacity at the local level. Local governments, again, are able to use federal dollars to do this beforehand. These are simplistic, durable units with capacity for expansion to be turned into permanent homes. So we can do this in as little as 7 days. We can get someone into one of these temporary units. Next slide, please. But the genius of this system is that this isn't going to result in that very infamous and well-known dead-end situation that we see in rural communities where people are stuck in the kind of infamous FEMA trailers, right? These are temporary units, they're stuck, they have nowhere to go. This can be, again, redesigned and programmed so that these temporary units are not being reclaimed by FEMA or taken out of the community. We're using those dollars to then transition them into permanent homes. And you can see our customers have a full range of choices in how they want that home to look. These are not mobile homes. These are permanent stick build with the foundation homes that they can custom build and make however they want. This is important for rural communities because often rural communities don't have choices, especially after a disaster. But even before so, usually it's just like, hey, this is the house you get. This is the unit you get. We're trying to bring choice to rural communities and disinvested communities for the first time in a long time in terms of their housing needs. Next slide, please. Again, families design these homes. I'll kind of move a little bit quicker in the interest of time. Next slide, please. The big part about pre-covery is that you have to do, like I said, that pre-planning. What's involved in that pre-planning? It is doing the contracting for labor so that you have contracts that you can immediately put into place post-disaster that brings workers back into an area, right? As soon as a disaster hits, usually there's economic instability. You want to be able to bring those workers back. And so you've got to pre-contract that. You pre-contract for materials. If you do all of these steps, the federal government will check off on making sure that you're able to use those dollars beforehand so that you can build your capacity to respond after. So this is something that really needs to be focused on. Texas has even passed laws to streamline this even further. All you have to do as a local community is adopt a plan to do this. It's just basically a plan that says, hey, all of the things that Rapido says, we're going to do. To date, no local community in Texas has done so. So this is something we really want to push and get awareness around that. Let's take some power back for our rural communities and let's kind of get this moving. Next slide. So again, last thing I'll say, I'll kind of wrap up. Rapido's main outcome is to provide choice in disaster housing by pre-covery, by doing a lot of the work beforehand so that you can have control over those federal dollars to make sure they serve the community the way that you want. So both steps, either improving the overall economic health of your community as we are through the Community Loan Center, or pre-planning for disaster and building capacity so that you can have your own destiny and your own solutions post-disaster. These are two kind of on-the-ground solutions that we see to address a lot of the problems that we just discussed. All right. You can continue to the last slide, which is simply my contact information. I'm happy to answer any further questions on this or put you in touch with any of some of the local community leaders that you may have that might be interested in adopting some of these models that we were talking about today. Thank you so much.
Thank you both Daniel and Chandra for the amazing presentations. We will now move on to the Q&A portion of the event. And once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box that we have. We can go ahead and get started. The question we have is, this one's for Chandra. What policy solutions does EPI recommend to overcome challenges in the South or other parts of the country that are reluctant to implement these policies? What progresses can be made to improve the conditions that you talked about?
Well, a lot of what, and again, this is from the earned perspective where we focus more on states rather than, yeah, one of the big things we focus on is collective bargaining. It's unions, it's workers being able to organize in order to improve their earnings and benefits. A lot of our earned groups, they will choose what their own policy priorities are based on their states and what the issues are. So for example, some of our groups are focused on like fines and fees, how that impacts people's ability to get and keep a job if your license is taken away behind certain fines and fees. And so that is definitely something we support them in trying to get legislation to stop taking away people's driver's licenses so that they can continue. We support our work is really focused on workers and empowering workers to the extent possible. So we focus a lot on the public sector as well, on public sector workers. So for example, one of our groups was just able to get an expansion of public sector bargaining. One of our earned groups was able to get a raise for county level workers in one of the counties. It wasn't statewide. So we really focus a lot on workers, on raising wages, getting those minimum wages up, raising those up. So those are some of the policies, but really any policies around workers, anything that empowers workers or uplift workers, we focus on.
Thank you so much. And for Daniel, this one's for you. In the comments, someone mentioned that this is an elegant and innovative solution. How do we expand this all over the country? So is Rapido being expanded across Texas or elsewhere? Or are there any other efforts to bring it to scale?
Yeah, so again, I can speak to how easy it is in Texas. It's really just about a local government adopting this as their pre-covery plan. But we've had a lot of people reach out to us about this idea from all over the country. Flooding recently in Kentucky, we had FEMA executives, as well as many local leaders in Kentucky, reach out to us. But this is unfortunately the answer we always have to give them, and we hate it, is they always just want to be like, well, how do you build those cool houses? And we're like, you should have called us 2 years ago. Like the recovery process is an entire contracting process that makes that money possible to flow into these homes. And so we've got to really emphasize that if we're going to expand this to scale, whether it's Kentucky, Texas, or Minnesota, it really doesn't matter. We have to have communities that can come together and do some of this pre-recovery planning, which that takes us into a whole other separate issue of capacity. I understand a lot of rural communities have some capacity concerns here. And that's where a lot of the work that we're doing with PRT is how can we bring capacity to communities so they can do the pre-planning, unlock the funding, and then build some of these very unique and innovative homes after a disaster. So it's the whole process I want to emphasize.
Thank you. No, and then you answered a follow-up question around why do you think other local communities have not adopted it? Is it capacity? And it seems like on your end, capacity is a big one. Thank you for that. Another question, this for Chandra. Whether it's in the South or elsewhere, how can we bring the green economy to rural areas of the country, whether it's in the auto manufacturing, as you talked about, or other sectors?
A lot of this, and this is, I think, a lot of these forgotten communities or ignored communities. It really is, I think, organizing communities to put pressure, because there's money that's going into the communities. There's more than enough. Talking about energy, for example, like there are ways to take those dollars. You can create jobs to upgrade people's homes. So you're creating good jobs and you're bringing in the infrastructure that's needed. You can upgrade homes so that their, fuel bills are cheaper. Like there are these ways, but a lot of this is getting politicians at the state and local level. It is incentivizing them to focusing on those that are actually going to focus on improving the lives of the community and to use that money in those ways. That to me seems to be the biggest barrier to getting that, is politicians who, want to take the money and pay off, fill back up the unemployment, like rather than actually spending it on the people of the state.
Thank you so much. And this next question for Jennifer, which is a question we've gotten around amongst the report around how do we go about choosing the communities that were profiled in the report?
Oh, sure. Well, first, as I mentioned, we looked for counties across the country where 25% or more of the population had incomes below the 100% of the federal poverty line in 2020. And as Chandra mentioned, the federal poverty line is woefully inadequate, but that's where we started with the thought, as I talked about, that if we can make change in places like this, we can really make a difference across frontline communities. And then from there, we wanted geographic diversity. So we looked for different parts of the country, rural and urban. And we also looked at population size. So a lot of counties are quite small. So we wanted to look at communities with at least a moderate size population. We also looked for racial and ethnic diversity, wanting to represent Latino, Black, and indigenous populations. So we had that kind of representation. And then to account for income inequality, in urban areas where, oftentimes you can, for example, where East Bridgeport is located in Connecticut, Fairfield County, where Bridgeport is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, but you can find pockets of very high need in these wealthy counties because the poverty becomes masked almost because of the degree of inequality. So for that reason, we picked 2 zip codes. So we picked East Las Vegas, which was largely, it has about 60% Latino population, and then the east end of Bridgeport.
Thank you for that. And as you mentioned, like highlighting both urban and rural are very important to do so. And this question's for Daniel. For the Rapido program, are communities applying before a disaster has even been identified? For example, in hurricane vulnerable states, would every household have the opportunity to design their new home and then build those plans only if a hurricane has damaged their home?
Yes. So the design of the permanent home happens after the disaster. So your home is destroyed, you are then placed into the temporary housing, but then you have that option of then designing your permanent house, and we can customize that and get that to you within a 6-month timeline, as opposed to what we face now, which is a 2 to 5 to none year timeline, which a lot of our communities are suffering now. Just to speak our own experience here in the Rio Grande Valley, when Hurricane Dolly hit in 2008, the reason Rapido came along was because by 2014, none of the housing stock had been replaced, not a single home. And so it was like, okay, obviously there's an issue here. So, but to answer the question, you do the customized rebuilding of your home after the disaster.
Thank you for that. And this for Chandra, the question is, did I hear correctly that there is an emphasis also on the lack of income taxes in the state as a strategy to benefit workers? How do you see the relationship between taxes and worker job security?
Can you read that again?
Yeah, no worries. The question was, and I quote, did I hear correctly that there is an emphasis also on the lack of income taxes in the state as a strategy to benefit workers? How do you see a relationship between taxes and worker job security?
I guess for me, I don't necessarily see a direct line between taxes and worker job security. That's a relationship I don't think I had thought about, so that's why I'm sitting here processing that now. Big taxes, I think there's a lot of emphasis put on taxes, and things are harms will come if you have taxes, and we don't see that in other places necessarily. Job security is a decision. I'm not saying there aren't real constraints on employers, but quite often those decisions are not made based on taxes. So I guess I see limited there. And I would also like to add something to the previous answer, where I talked about putting pressure on government to spend those federal funds on people in the community. There are also instances where communities have been able to put pressure on employers to get like community benefits agreements, so that those employers don't just extract from the community, but also are required to reinvest into those communities as well. So there are, other ways to put that pressure, to find those pressure points to make those changes.
Thank you for that clarification. And with that, we are approaching the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for jumping on with us today and extend extreme gratitude for our speakers today for partnering with us for the event. We hope that you can join us for part 2 of our series, which is titled The Effects of Health and Housing Quality on Climate Vulnerability and Resilience. We'll dive deeper into health and housing. We did link the registration link for the next webinar, and also we'll follow up with materials, including recording of today's event and the post-event survey in the chat. So please feel free to take a moment to fill it out and share your thoughts with us. If you have any further questions, feel free to leave those in the comments in the post-event survey or email us. But thank you all again, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your week.